All right. Looks like a thin gathering today. Are we ready to roll?
I just got word from Jordan that he's going to be a few minutes late, but he will be here. So,
okay. Is he sitting in for Mirta or the mayor?
He's sitting in for the mayor, and I just got off another meeting with Mirta a few minutes ago, and she was still on. So she may. I'm assuming she'll be joining us shortly, so we can probably get started. And
okay. Well, we'll get rolling here and add those folks as they become available. So to kick things off, I'd like to call to order today's October 20th TPCC meeting, and let's begin with a roll call and see who is here. So Mierta is not here yet. We'll see if she joins us. Peter Benson. No Peter Benson, and no John Engen. Jordan will be filling in for him when he arrives. Don MacArthur.
Don MacArthur, Missoula Urban Transportation District.
Thanks, Don. Lucia Oliveira.
This is Ryan Hammond here for Lucia.
Hi, Ryan. Thanks.
Hi.
Commissioner Slotnick is not here yet. This is Dave Strohmeyer. I'm chairing the meeting today. Bob Vosen.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bob Vosen with MDT.
Hi, Bob. Nice background.
Yeah, thank you.
Debbie Johnston.
Debbie Johnston, Missoula City County Air Pollution Control Board.
Okay, thanks. That is everyone on the list of voting and non-voting members. We have minutes to approve from August. Well, first off, let's see. Do we even have a quorum here? Let's see.
Mirta just got on, and so I think that brings us to a quorum.
Okay.
I'm here.
Mirta, just in the nick of time, we were taking the very controversial move of approving minutes from August 18th. So are there any additions or corrections to those minutes?
No, they look fine.
Okay, seeing none, they will stand approved. Is there any public comment on items not on today's agenda? Okay, seeing none, we will move right into our one item of new business. This is an update on the long-range transportation plan scenario development and metrics. Aaron, do you want to kick this off for us?
Sure. I'll always do a brief intro. We're continuing to move things along with the long-range transportation plan. I'm trying to think of the last time we met as a body with TPCC. I think it was back in August. And we've been doing a lot of work since then, developing our scenarios, scoring and ranking projects, putting those into the different scenarios, and then starting to evaluate those or develop some of the evaluation metrics for those. And so this is kind of a chance to check in with all of you. We've had some kind of small group meetings with various folks over the last several weeks. So some of this might be repeating a little bit of that, but we've also made some progress and I think refined our approach a little bit. And this will be sort of our check-in before we take this out to the public over the next month or two in November and December. And we'll have a little bit of info at the end of the presentation about how we're thinking of doing that. And so this is a check-in before we come back in December or January with some results and start working on the draft plan and recommendations. So it's I think kind of a key check-in point to make sure we're on the right track and doing what we need to do to help all of you make some decisions in the future when we get to actually putting together the draft plan. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Jennifer. As always, she has a good presentation to run through that will bring us all up to speed with where we're at.
Great. Well, thanks, Aaron, and good afternoon, everybody. Jennifer Wieland with Nelson Nygaard. Yeah,
hey, Jennifer. Dave. Yeah, before we get rolling, just wanted to make sure that we get it on the record that Commissioner Josh Slotnick has now joined us. So It's all yours, Jennifer.
Tardy arrival.
Great, great. Thank you. So as Aaron mentioned, there is a lot of content in the presentation today, and I know many of you have seen portions of this over the last couple of weeks as we've had some chance, a chance for some small group and one-on-one discussions. So I'll go relatively quickly through the piece that helps to describe the scenarios, because we do have some new information that we've actually just been developing over the last few days that starts to share with you some of what we're seeing in terms of the early results of scenario analysis. And certainly this is just a piece of what that will look like. As Aaron mentioned, we're preparing for outreach that will start roughly in the middle of November. And so there will be more metrics developed. There will be more analysis done over the next couple of weeks, but would love your thoughts and direction as we kick this off today. So let me pull up our slides here. And again, because this is a relatively, once we start talking about transportation networks and scenarios, there's a lot of content here and it can get pretty dense. And so please do chime in with questions as we go rather than saving them up until discussion time at the end. We want to make sure that we're clarifying as we move our way through. So just as a quick reminder, Aaron mentioned that when we were last in front of TPCC, it was probably middle of August, and we were just coming out of a period where we'd been engaging with the public to solicit project ideas for the long-range transportation plan. So in that time, we have scored and evaluated the projects. We'll talk a little bit about what that's looked like and now shaped them into first a comprehensive project list and now scenarios. We've also met with our technical and citizens advisory committees and have engaged directly with TTAC, the Transportation Technical Advisory Committee, on a couple of different occasions. So we really appreciate everybody's time and enthusiasm in getting us to this point. There has been a lot of input. We wanted to start the discussion today about developing scenarios with just a quick reminder of why we do scenario planning. This is something we talked about in August, and just want to remind everybody that, part of the reason that we go through this process in long-range transportation plans in particular, but in most of our planning processes, is so that we can really start to illustrate trade-offs, so that we can really start to understand the ways that different combinations of investments, whether those are projects or programs or even policies that might be put in place in the region, how those combinations of investments move us toward our goals. And so often in a scenario planning process, we'll really try and drive some differences or shape some differences between the scenarios so that we can see those interactions differently. So hopefully, as Aaron and I start to share with you what we've done in shaping the land use scenarios and the transportation network scenarios, you'll see some of that. The scenario planning process is also intended to be iterative. It is intended to be really responsive to stakeholder input. And so we don't necessarily anticipate that we're going to come out of this scenario planning process and have TPCC or another entity point at a single scenario and just say, yep, that one's perfect as is, no need to make changes. This is really a way to understand performance and then be able to make adjustments so that we're ultimately getting to the right list of recommended projects for the long-range plan. So I did want to take just a quick second and reorient us to our goals, because these are important both in terms of how we scored the projects, but then also how we're starting to think about the scenarios and our evaluation of them. So our goals focus on safety and health, sustainability and resilience, expanding mobility choices, connecting and strengthening communities around a more equitable region, and maintaining assets and investing strategically. I think it's important as we think about what we mean when we talk about an equitable region to be clear that we are looking at both particular populations and also access. So we are looking carefully at low-income populations, people of color, people with disabilities, younger folks, so people under the age of 18, and then older folks over the age of 65. Those are some of our populations that we focus on because of some additional vulnerabilities and also historic inequities. We focus on access to services and jobs as a key piece of equity, and then also affordability, especially when it comes to affordable and senior housing. So that's an important frame as we start to think about the land use goals, and then also one of our scenarios that really targets regional equity. You've seen this filtering diagram before, and what I want to make sure I mention today is we are in this phase, in the develop and rank scenario. So really step 4 of the process. We gathered the projects and programs, as I mentioned, through public outreach, through working with our technical staff and agency partners. We screened all of those, and then we've gone through a pretty rigorous scoring process. Today, we're going to talk about 3 transportation network scenarios. And again, we aren't anticipating that you will necessarily choose one of those or that the public will choose one, but the evaluation of the scenarios does help point us to that final recommended list of projects. At the end of the day, through the long range plan, we need a fiscally constrained and prioritized list. And so that is where we're headed through this process. We're just about a step in advance of that right now. So for those of you who are ready to get to the final answer, we're getting there. We've just got another step or 2 and another opportunity for public input as we go. So to start us off in terms of scenarios, I'm going to have Aaron talk a little bit about the ways that we've focused our thinking around growth, because this is an important part of then how we shape our transportation network scenarios.
Yeah, thanks. So to put the growth scenarios into context, we talk a lot about the need to link transportation and land use sort of in a lot of the planning that we're doing now. For instance, the Mullen Area Master Plan is a great example where we've really been trying to hammer home that how we develop and growth patterns have a big impact on transportation system. And then our transportation investments have a big impact on how we can support the growth patterns that we want to see. So our intention with the growth scenarios is not necessarily to say we think we should do something different on land use or zoning, or to make, to evaluate something that will go into recommendations in those growth policies, but is really around looking at 2 fairly different potential growth outcomes in 2050, where those households and employment will go, and what impact that has on the transportation system within each of the transportation scenarios that we've developed. So there are a couple of pieces with that we've thought about, or when we were putting those growth scenarios together, we kept growth rates the same under each scenario. So we're looking at the same projected total number of households and population in 2050. And we used a growth rate of about 1.5%, which has been fairly consistent throughout the last, I don't know how many years in Missoula, but it's been fairly consistent. And whether that ends up being the actual growth rate over the next 30 years is really, who knows? There's so many factors that go into that, but it's a consistent rate that is based on some historic patterns and is pretty reasonable for a 30-year projection. So we came up with 2 sort of growth scenarios. One is business as usual, where we looked at where growth has been occurring, where there's existing capacity to absorb it, and sort of just distributed those households throughout those areas where there are capacity. Not thinking a little bit, it's based on our planning documents, so things like the growth policies and our existing land use and existing zoning, but it isn't necessarily targeting specific areas where we would put more or less households. It's sort of being distributed throughout the region based on those historic growth patterns. So what that means is, we continue to see some growth in the core, and that business as usual still reflects that there is a fair amount of growth in the core of Missoula. But there's also some areas of growth like the Y, where we're seeing a pretty substantial potential for growth, and sort of previous planning documents had projected a number of potentially thousands of households going in that area. There's also growth going in places that aren't shown on this map, like Lolo and Sealy Lake, and areas outside of the urban area. So this is really reflecting kind of that historic growth pattern over the last 10 to 20 years, and some of our planning documents, like the growth policies and the downtown master plan. The other approach or growth scenario that we put together, we're calling strategic growth. Again, this isn't intended to change our things like the growth policy or our underlying land use or zoning, but it was looking at what happens if we sort of maximize that strategy of focus inward and maximize some of the other planning processes like the Mullen Area Master Plan. So we have some info from that plan about how much capacity there is if we were to fully implement that master plan. And so we looked at that and said, what if we maximize that over the next 30 years and put all of that growth there? And what happens if we maximize some areas like the Brooks corridor, where we've done some planning and there's plenty of capacity there with today's existing zoning and land use? What happens if we get closer to maximizing that area and really focus inward, to be a little bit redundant, but and pulling that from areas like the Y, where there's maybe less infrastructure, areas west of the Molinary master plan where we, sort of airport and beyond, and then areas outside of the urbanized area that might have seen more growth in the business as usual. Josh, you're muted if you have a question. Sorry, I can see you talking.
Thank you. So it's just a quick question. If you were to go kind of toggle back and forth between those last two slides, I just wanted to make sure I understood the difference between the one that's blue and the one that's green, and comparing the business as usual to the strategic growth. What are the highlight changes here we should be looking at?
Yeah, maybe Jennifer, if you could go to that last slide, because I think that really highlights where we're seeing changes in. So this map is showing where those changes are. So the dark red color is where we are showing a lot of additional growth in the strategic growth. So this is a sort of difference between the two scenarios. So we pulled potential growth from areas like the Y and Target Range Orchard Homes, and the area west of the airport, and focus that growth in like the Brooks corridor, the core of Missoula, and the Molinary master plan. And again, this is all based on what existing zoning and land use would allow. And so we're not necessarily looking at what happens if we change all of those things. We're looking at what happens if we really focus that effort and start to maximize development in areas that have existing infrastructure. What does that do to our transportation system, and how does that relate to the investment scenarios that we've put together? So that's kind of the key changes here. We were looking at focusing on these sort of larger, you can kind of see in this map, the larger sub areas. We didn't get down to allocating households at a specific block or it's bigger, almost more like neighborhood areas or regional sub areas that we looked at. And so that's kind of the idea, is that we create these two sort of bookend analyses or growth scenarios that would allow us to look at what is the influence of those different growth patterns on our transportation system.
And Aaron, I think the only piece I would add to this is I do think the percentage change between the two is helpful. So essentially what we tried to do is move about 10% of the households in the strategic growth scenario. And the thinking there is that, as Aaron mentioned, we do want to try and see some differences in terms of the analysis and modeling. And so that was a threshold that we set for ourselves as we worked with county and city land use planners to develop this. Let's pause here for a quick second and see if there are other questions about these growth scenarios and the way that we intend to use them.
Other questions from folks? Doesn't look like it yet. So continue on, Jennifer.
Great. We'll move into our transportation network scenarios then. So one of the things that as we have moved through this process, we started to think about, gosh, how do you combine two different growth scenarios and then multiple transportation scenarios? And what we want to emphasize is that we're really using the growth scenarios to see how these three transportation scenarios perform differently with different land use contexts or different growth patterns. So we're really going to focus our attention around these three transportation scenarios. And what we're hoping to hear from you today is whether there are core projects that feel like they're missing from these scenarios, or if there's additional clarity needed as we think about how we describe these and how we move them forward. So part of the reason that we developed three scenarios is, again, to be able to test what we hope are pretty different outcomes. One of the things that is a little bit unique to Missoula's long-range plan is that all of your projects, or almost all of the projects that are included in the master list of projects, which has 170 some projects, are really multimodal when we think about them all together. So you have active transportation projects, biking and walking, you have complete streets projects, transit projects, projects that improve safety at intersections and that really work for all modes of transportation. You don't have a lot of projects on your list that are large roadway expansions or new roadways that just provide vehicular capacity. And that's a great thing in terms of the goals that you have set out for this region. It also presented a few challenges as we were developing the scenarios, because again, we wanted to think about how do we shape those scenarios a little bit differently. So we did try and focus the scenarios around the projects that do the most to advance the regional goals. That means that not all of the 170 some projects are included in a scenario. Many of them are, but we did really try and narrow it down to projects that, again, when we scored them against the goals, did the most to move us toward where the region has said it wants to go. Another important thing that we did is we did set a funding constraint for these scenarios. We assigned all of the region's committed projects to the scenarios as a way to start. And so those are projects like the build grant investments that we know are moving forward, that are going to be finished, projects from the MPO's Transportation Improvement Program, and then also from the city's Capital Improvement Program. So that ends up being about $110 million in projects. Not a small chunk of change, even when we think about the next 5 to 6 years. With some pretty conservative revenue projections, we are left with $178 million to spend over the next 30 years when we think about the projects that get included in these scenarios. 178 million sounds like a lot, and then you start to break it down over 30 years and realize that, gosh, that goes quickly, especially when we think about some of the more expensive transportation improvements that may be needed. So that fiscal constraint is important, and you will see that come into play as we look at the different scenarios. So the way that we approached assigning the projects to scenarios, this is really where the evaluation process came very heavily into play. We scored all of the projects against our goals and the evaluation criteria that we shared with you in August. And then we took the top 2 tiers of projects. So those are the projects that score the best across all of our goals, and assigned all of those top 2 tier projects to at least one scenario. Then we did some additional weighting and really focused in on equity and safety. We also identified projects that advance Mountain Lion strategic plan, so some of the key transit supportive projects. And then we looked really carefully for projects that had been identified as community priorities, and also those that are in Invest Health neighborhoods. That was part of the way that we rounded out some of the scenarios. We also took a really careful look at geographic balance. Not that there has to be a project in every single area of the region, but we did want to ensure that we weren't developing scenarios that only had projects in the core of Missoula, for example, and did nothing to provide connectivity and advance our goals in the other areas of the region. So that was an important piece of developing the scenarios as well. So again, we have 3 different scenarios. We're going to walk through each of these. And you have in your meeting materials lists of the projects that are included in each of the scenarios if you'd like to reference those. So the 3 that we developed, the first we call New Connections, which really focuses on expanding our multimodal networks and creating new routes. The second is about enhancing connections, and here we focus on maintaining and improving the existing network and also filling some of the key gaps. And then the third scenario focuses on regional equity. And this is where we've looked very carefully at the Invest Health neighborhoods, at projects that do the most to advance equity when we weight that goal more heavily, and also really thinking about affordability in terms of the investments that we're making. So we'll go through a series of maps for each of these, and I'll do a little bit of toggling back and forth. Let me just orient you to how these maps look as we move across the scenarios. So apologies for those of you that are colorblind. I'll do my best to describe what we're seeing on these maps. The darkest lines that hopefully show up for all of you that are in black are the committed projects. So you are going to see these across all of the scenarios. And so obviously the build grant pops out here. And then you're going to see in all of the scenarios, different colored projects, depending on the type of project it is. And we did this just to be able to illustrate that each of these scenarios really is multimodal. So the red lines and dots are active transportation, so walking or biking projects. The purple lines and dots are complete streets and roadway projects. And then in some of the scenarios, you will see some green dots and maybe a few green lines as well, which are safety improvements. So we're first looking at our new connections scenario. And this scenario, again, really focuses on expanding the networks and really also focuses on expanding the roadway network through complete street reconstruction. Again, improvements for all modes, but a focus on some of these more major projects. There are also new trails and bridges included here, including a non-motorized bridge from McCormick Park, and then some pretty significant investments in terms of Russell Street to I-90, for example, and some bigger dollar projects. One of the things that you see on this map are a series of dashed lines. Those are projects that we felt like, you know, they would really fit within this scenario, but they didn't make it across the funding cut. So what you're actually looking at in terms of the projects in this scenario that fit within that 178 million we have available are simply the solid lines and the darker dots. So that really concentrates this scenario sort of in the core of the city of Missoula, within the city limits, with a few projects out toward East Missoula and up toward the Rattlesnake as well. So a little bit more limited than if you were looking at everything shown on this map. So the second scenario, I'll run through this one and then we can do a little back and forth comparison, is our enhanced connections scenario. And in this one, we focus on improving our existing systems again. So through this scenario, we look at how do we enhance the current networks, thinking very carefully about inward growth. So we did keep that strategic growth scenario in mind as we were developing this scenario. This does really focus on closing gaps. And there are a few different ways that you'll see that. So all of the projects that are shown on this map fit within the 178 million funding constraint. So even as we compare this to the new connection scenario, you'll see there are a lot more projects. This one includes a lot of the neighborhood greenways, a good number of intersection improvements, and then a lot of active transportation projects that are in many cases a bit more affordable. Another key thing that we focused on with this scenario is completing some of the connections. So you can see that with the investments that are being made in Mullen, the build roads, we really focused on the ways that we could complete the network and make that new development, make that area of new growth really connected to the rest of the city and region. So I'll just do a quick toggle back and forth between these two maps because I think it's a helpful illustration. So again, this is enhanced connections. And then as we go backwards to new connections, you can see the difference in terms of the number of projects. You can also see a little bit of the sort of disconnectedness, honestly, of these investments where we're not focused so much on connecting to the build investment versus that real inward focus with enhanced connections. And then the third of the scenarios is our regional equity scenario. And again, with this scenario, we really focused on the projects that do the most to advance equity and affordability when we looked at really weighting those projects more heavily. So this concentrates projects in some of the Invest Health neighborhoods. It really focuses on more affordable transportation investments, thinking about an equitable use of transportation funds. So you'll see a lot of active transportation projects here as well. This scenario includes the West Side Greenway Trail, a good handful of shared use paths, and then a number of important bikeway connections as well. So regional equity, if we flip back to enhanced connections, you can see there's a lot of overlap between these two, but some important differences in terms of how we think about the spread of projects and then also the ways that we think about connections. So I'm going to pause. Well, okay, I'll say one more thing and then I will stop talking for a minute. So the projects that are not included in any of the scenarios will not be lost in the long range plan. They will go on the illustrative list of projects. These are projects that are, again, they're good projects. They just don't do as much to advance the goals as those we've included in the scenarios. Some of these could be alternatives to projects that are included within one of the scenarios. So they may be elevated through another point in the process, but just wanted to give you a sense of some that were not included. So let me pause there and open it up for questions and discussion about these scenarios, and then we'll share some initial results with you all.
Thanks, Jennifer. Questions or comments from the committee?
One comment.
Josh.
The enhanced connection scenario is really inspiring and makes me want to like figure out how we make that happen. I get it's 2050. It's just I'm inspired by a place that has that level of connectivity and thinking that's going to really serve the needs of urban Missoula that'll have 15, 20,000 more people in it. I like the vision.
Great. Thank you for that, Josh. And you definitely hit on part of what we were trying to do with this scenario, which is really to illustrate the ways that the network can knit together.
Others?
Yeah.
Jordan.
Hi, everyone. And I'm sorry I was a few minutes late. I'm a proxy for the mayor today. So I've been lurking here for a little while now. But this is great. I really appreciate these different frameworks. I think that I largely agree with Josh on the connectivity is really enticing. I think my personal favorite is the equity scenario. I think that's a really nice balance of really improving connectivity as well as focusing on areas that really need infrastructure investment. I think equity, as we look at the cost of housing and everything else in Missoula, is going to be a really critical issue. So I think for me, that one's the balance there is really cool, and I appreciate your work on these. These are great.
Jennifer, do you have a map that that reflects the overlap between some of these scenarios, such as equity and the connectivity?
I do not have one handy, but we could absolutely create that. That would be really helpful for folks. If you are interested in looking at the projects that do cross the different scenarios, there are some large 11 by 17 sheets included in your packet that have the full list of projects, and you can see for each project which scenarios it falls in. There are a handful. Let's see, Brooks Complete Street is one that comes to mind as crossing all three scenarios, but there are certainly more than that, Dave. And so we could provide a map of that overlap as a follow-up, but the list is a place to be able to look right now. And Aaron, feel free to chime in with others that jump to mind for you.
Jennifer, what's the project in the regional equity scenario that runs along 3rd Street west of Reserve?
Oops, am I on the right?
It's called the Slotnick Memorial Byway.
I think there's a couple of improvements in and I'd have to remind myself what got included in the regional equity.
Mm-hmm.
But there's I know from Hyberta West, it's really looking at getting multimodal connections through there, and like safe multimodal connections. So essentially from the school west to Clements, and that could be either added bike lanes or a shared use path. I think shared use path might be the most efficient.
Maybe a similar thing from Hyberta east to Grove Street to reach the bike network.
Yeah, I think from Hyberta to the city, because that is a more urban part of third, and actually the street itself has been annexed into the city. The adjacent properties haven't, but I think that's anticipated to be a complete street because you do have the connection from Reserve into the school. There's some transit stops along there, I believe, and so that I think we anticipated that being a complete street, and then when you get west of Hyberta, you start to get more into a rural or suburban rural setting that. Curb gutter sidewalks probably not the right level of infrastructure.
And I had one other question. This kind of points towards equity a little bit. If I understand it right, you all were this kind of strategic growth focus. You said instead of looking at growth in places like Target Range and the South Hills, concentrating it along these corridors where there's a lot more infrastructure. And one of the thoughts that just jumped into my head is, what does that do to places like Target Range and Orchard Homes? And I think what it does is it turns them into estates. And places that are worth tons of money because of the space around them, and that space is such a rarity with tight proximity to town. And I get that that's absolutely an accidental consequence. The mission here isn't to make multi-millionaire or millionaire landowners out of Target Rangers, but it kind of does that. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, that's a big question for
That's all right.
Yeah, Jennifer, did you have a?
Wow. I mean, that seems dangerous for me to answer this, Aaron. Well, I mean, Josh, I think it's a very fair question, and it is certainly it's a possible byproduct. Really what we wanted to illustrate with that focus inward are the ways that land use decisions shape the types of transportation investments we can make and the outcomes that we can see. And so I guess if we were looking at this purely from a land use perspective, there might be a different set of considerations, including what you're framing up. We're really trying to think about how do we maximize the dollars that we'll have to spend from a transportation perspective.
You're being really kind. You could have said, like, shut up, this is a conversation, not land use and planning. And I would have abided, but you're right. I couldn't, my mind went too fast there.
Well, and it may be that that's a question for Karen and Andrew, and growth policy update of if we do this focused growth, we focus more growth in the urban core, how do we ensure that we're maintaining that equity across, or not having those unintended consequences? Because I don't think we can address that in the transportation plan, but we can show the benefit side of it or potential benefit from the transportation side, and then there's always that communication between our plans, and that's where the coordination is. I think
I was jumping ahead and coloring outside the lines a little bit, but couldn't help but see it. So
yeah.
Just shut your yapper, Josh. We've had enough.
I have a question for you guys.
Yeah, Peter.
I like the regional equity scenario as well, but I worry about, the enhanced scenario connects a lot of dots or lines. And I really worry about developments like the Mullen area plan, where if we don't prioritize connecting that part of the new part of the city to the rest of it, we really run into traffic jams, no pun intended. So I kind of want both. And I don't know how. I keep thinking about the fact that should we look at any of these by how expensive they are? Are there easy fixes that would do a lot for both scenarios? But we really have to think about this one because it's going to, this particular stretch, because it's so expensive. Is that a way of thinking about any of this?
It is, Peter, and we did use a cost constraint when we developed these scenarios. So the projects that you are seeing, and again, these are planning level costs, but the projects that you're seeing on enhanced connections and regional equity, all of those projects in each scenario do fit within the 178 million funding constraint that we've found. Now, if we were to try and do a little bit of a mashup and add some projects to one scenario or another, then we'd want to think carefully about whether there are some more expensive investments that could be either put off until later or could be redesigned in a way that would bring down the cost. So I do think that is an opportunity as we evaluate the scenarios and move to a recommended list.
So this is Bob, and I like where you're going, Peter. Come up with some kind of a benefit cost type component to the discussion is what you're suggesting, I think.
Jennifer, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if Peter was.
Sorry, I just said, yeah, that's in essence, that's part of what I'm thinking about.
Yeah. So, that is part of the reason that we did develop cost constrained scenarios, is so that we would have that fixed cost. And then as we move through the evaluation of the scenarios, we'll be able to see different types of benefits. Now, certainly, Peter and Bob, as you're suggesting, we can do that on a project by project level. A benefit cost analysis at a project level is pretty time consuming and detailed. And so we've waited to do that until we're closer to what we think might be a preferred scenario. But yes, that would be a great way to continue refining from here.
I have one other question that about this, and where does maintenance fit into these costs? I mean, I'm seeing a lot of projects on my network that aren't there, that I know I've got a tremendous value of maintenance that I'm going to have to perform in the next 30 years. So is dollars coming from our source, are those being reduced to account for the fact that I know that I've got maintenance costs that come in front of any other expansion of any sort?
It's a good question, Bob. And certainly as we think about expanding networks, we need to be accounting for life cycle costs and the fact that maintenance will go up. Aaron, do you want to talk about how we looked at maintenance dollars in the revenue forecast? Because I think that's important.
Yeah, so I think because we're using such a conservative projection in available revenue, like we really aren't considering much, if any, federal dollars that, like national highways or interstate maintenance in that 178 million. So those are, funding sources that would be that we haven't really even touched yet. The other piece is things like gas tax. So a large chunk of the gas tax for the city and the county go towards roadway maintenance, and we did not consider that to be discretionary for the purpose of building these scenarios, because that is maintenance dollars, and we're really talking about like what is more like a capital, like a CIP type investment scenarios. Like what are the new projects that we're going to build, as opposed to how many dollars are we going to invest in maintenance. And so that same piece is true for sort of federal dollars that we know, like federal or state gas tax that goes to maintenance within the Missoula area. We haven't really even touched that yet in terms of what's going to be available. So Bob, I think it's a really good question, and I think we should be looking at maintenance costs as we're evaluating these different scenarios, and what additional maintenance are we going to create for ourselves versus what we have already programmed, knowing that we're struggling to meet our maintenance targets with what we already have.
Right, exactly, Aaron. And in the enhanced connections, what caught my eye was focusing on maintaining what we already have, which is that falls right in line with where we are with MDT. I mean, that's our first focus, is maintaining. But anyhow, just a huge concern, and that's everything that we're doing going forward. I mean, Missoula's been a great partner for us to work with from a maintenance standpoint, being willing to take on the responsibilities for some of the additional facilities we're constructing and the enhancements we're building. But I'm definitely not seeing that in most of the communities that we're in. So I do appreciate that here in Missoula. I will share that.
Yeah, it's a great point, Bob. Thanks.
I'm glad. Thanks for saying that, Bob.
So Aaron, speaking to that maintenance question, have you looked at the monies that you indicated that you were planning for maintenance and comparing them to what Bob sees and what we understand to be our maintenance needs? Is it sufficient, between the gas tax and the highway money? Do we have sufficient money to maintain?
That's a good question, and I don't want to give too much of an off the cuff answer to that, because I think we have
no.
right, yeah,
probably no. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, I mean, so we have this pavement study that we've done that we haven't really integrated that into this process yet. And I think my hope is that we can give some presentations next month to start looking at some of those maintenance issues and what is our pavement condition, what is it going to take to maintain that long term. So we're starting to do that work. We haven't really done it as part of the long range plan, or we haven't looked very closely at the cost and the need. And so I think that's something that needs to be built on as we start to develop the plan. And I think we have some base tools and data that will help us get there. So maybe that's a good lead into hopefully next month, if we have time in our agenda, we have this pavement maintenance report that we can use to get a sense of where we're at.
So Don, and I didn't mean to be completely flippant there, but I think it does reflect some degree of reality in that this pavement maintenance assessment that we just went through, and here I'm just speaking strictly on the county side of the equation, and correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, I think we spend, I don't know, $400,000 or so a year for Missoula County, and the assessment put us at needing a couple million, I don't in the millions, in order to truly maintain our system at the standard that we would like. So we are way behind the 8 ball in terms of maintaining what we have right now. So it is a completely salient question as far as if we are building new infrastructure, what incrementally would that add to our maintenance needs and perhaps backlog.
And the other piece of that, not to sort of belabor the point too much, but something that I think the city is interested in, and that I'm certainly interested in, is looking at different, coming back to the growth scenarios a little bit, doing some fiscal analysis. Probably it'll happen outside the long range transportation plan, but doing some fiscal growth analysis of what do different growth scenarios do for us in terms of revenue versus maintenance costs. Because density does have an impact there, that it's more cost effective to build density, and especially the right kind of density. And so all of those things together are sort of going to dictate how well we're doing 30 years from now. Like how much are we sprawling? How much infrastructure are we building? What is our tax base? And what does that mean in terms of our ability to maintain the infrastructure?
Good questions.
I do have a quick question, if that's okay. Aaron, I know that I asked this and you gave me an answer, but I'm an old lady and I already forgot. For non-motorized projects, does the budget include MRA funding?
Yep. Yeah. So we looked at sort of averaging, like, what's the average annual investment that our TIF districts make into transportation, and then projected that out with the same sort of general growth rates that we use for other funding sources. So there's a modest amount of urban renewal funds in there, because we know that that's one of our, the primary ways that we're building infrastructure in the city right now.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I am fully aware of how the sausage is made and everything that has to go into putting together these scenarios. So I really appreciate you putting before us these really well-balanced scenarios that take into account where we're headed with our development. And it is really a responsibility that we have to provide the right kind of infrastructure to the places that we are targeting for more development. And so I guess for me, the dilemma is that one of the scenarios focuses on providing that infrastructure to newer development or where we're growing, versus maybe enhancing development that's already there, that's going to be pressured by added development. And so trying to create that balance, I think it's going to be tricky. And I guess that's why I was asking about the MRA funding, because although not a huge amount, it's a steady stream of income that can help us address the focus inward sort of non-motorized transportation projects versus what's out towards Mall and Reserve. We're gonna have to be depending on development fees and some other revenue sources. So, but thank you I think you really heard what's important to this community and the equity aspect of it. And that shows in the two scenarios.
I have another question, or at least a point of view that I'd like to share. When you presented this to us a little earlier, Jennifer, Don and I and you and Aaron were in a conversation about the merits of strategic growth. I mean, a step backwards from this, instead of simply responding to the market needs that arise in the city or in the county. There's a lot of merit in focusing on strategic growth here. And I still, based even with what we've been hearing, I still think that's a really good idea, that we need to plan for what we think is going to happen, even if it doesn't happen. We should make put our best foot forward to deal with the situations that we think are coming down the road. What's going to happen with the Mullen area? Like Josh said, what's going to happen with Target Range? Is that going to be a place that's going to grow? How do we have to consider these differently in the kind of transportation that we provide them? How much are they going to cost? So I really do think I support the strategic growth model in a general sense. And I'd like to hear what you other guys think about this.
Don?
Well, yes, Peter, that is a good summary of what we were talking about a few days ago. I guess my other thought was just that the investment in transportation is one of the tools that a community has to actually be strategic about growth, more so often than land use regulation. And so, as I look at these scenarios, I think this is our opportunity to proactively invest in a strategic vision of how we want the community to look. So, that it's super complicated. I really appreciate the three scenarios that have been developed, echoing other people on the board. But what I like about it is that they are coordinated, not just in a, Bob brought up the cost benefit analysis. These I think are looking at a cost benefit analysis of a suite of projects, not individual projects. Like, how do these add up to a strategic vision rather than just did this one score the best on its own? And I appreciate that sort of coordinated idea of how, 20 or 30 or 40 projects over the long term could add up to something that really is more than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, that's well said, Don. Thanks. Others? Jennifer, would you like to respond?
I was just going to say that is the perfect transition into the last thing that we wanted to share with you all, but I don't want to interrupt other comments or thoughts about this piece.
Why don't you go ahead, Jennifer, and that might spur some additional thinking.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you. So as Don was just mentioning, part of the reason that we do go through this very systematic approach is to look at the individual projects first, and then to try and combine them in ways that will have different types of outcomes. And so this is where we do start to look at the network and the impacts of making all of these investments at one time. So we're just going to share a couple of highlights with you all today. I did want to just mention, when we think back to our goals and try and talk about the outcomes that we want to be able to report on, there are a handful of metrics that we are trying to assess when it comes to the performance of the scenarios. So we want to see how one of the scenarios versus another performs when it comes to safety, when it comes to mode share. Are we getting more walking, biking, and transit trips versus vehicle trips? We want to be able to look at greenhouse gas emissions reduction. We want to look at delay and travel time. And then also to get at some of our equity measures, we want to look at access to jobs and to other important services and places and think holistically about affordability, not just the cost of projects, but what the combinations of projects can do in terms of combined household and housing and transportation costs for people. I really appreciate the comments about maintenance, and we want to be able to consider network condition. So are we bringing our existing network into a state of better repair through these scenarios? So these are a few pieces that we are starting to look at. We're going to touch on just a couple of quick examples today. I am not a travel modeler. I'm just going to say that right now. We have Dave on the line in case anybody really wants to get into the weeds of 4-step models. But what we want to share with you all is just we want to make it clear the tools that we are using to do some of this assessment. And the regional travel demand model is one of those tools. It is what's called a traditional 4-step model. And so it really looks at assigning trips in different ways. So we use land uses and we use households to generate trips. So how many trips will be generated? And then we go through a process of assigning those trips to destination. So where is the end point of that trip? It is generated from, let's say, a home or a job, and then it is going somewhere. The next piece of the 4-step model is the decision about the mode that will be used. So how is that trip going to be made? And then the last piece, once the mode has been selected, is what route will that trip take? Again, we use I here as though I am making each of these individual decisions. What the model tries to do is replicate decision-making behavior that someone might go through based on the choices that are available for them. So travel demand models have been in use for a long time. It is, again, a really powerful tool, but there are limitations when it comes to a regional travel demand model. One of the most important of those is that regional travel demand models are best at assessing impacts at a regional level. You really need some big moves and big changes to be able to see big differences in a regional travel demand model. And that's not to say that it is not fine-tuned enough to show us some things, but we don't always see the sorts of sweeping numbers changes that we might expect. Some of that is, if you're only focused on what a regional travel demand model does best, which is assess impacts and benefits related to, in many cases, vehicle travel, you might think about investments in new roadway connections at a regional level, or many new investments in roadway connections, as being something that a regional travel demand model would do a great job of assessing. Adding a protected bike facility to a road that has maybe a sharrow right now is not something that the model captures really well. It can't really predict how upgrades to infrastructure are going to make a difference in terms of people's travel behavior. So that, I think, is a really important piece, and part of why we are using a handful of off-model tools to be able to understand the ways that, for example, an enhanced connections scenario would have different impacts and benefits. Because again, as you're upgrading infrastructure, it's not always easy to capture in the model. Aaron or Dave, anything that you want to add on that front? Okay.
So, hey, Jennifer, I
Yeah,
guess
Dave.
on that point, this is a different Dave, but so when we're talking upgrades to infrastructure, take the Slotnick Memorial Parkway out 3rd Street. Right now, I would not, it's not my preferred path to ride a bike out there, just because you've got like 6 inches of pavement outside the fog line to do so on. And so adding additional shoulder width or a facility that would allow biking would arguably be an enhancement, but it would also perhaps significantly increase the likelihood that some folks would use that roadway to travel by other than a motor vehicle. So would that not factor into this at all?
In terms of the model outputs, that's exactly the kind of thing that is difficult to capture, Dave. So what you might see in the model is if, for example, you removed a travel lane to have enough space to make a bike facility improvement, that's an impact that's going to show up in the model. But what it's really going to look like is a disbenefit to people driving as opposed to a benefit to people biking. So that's part of the reason that we're using some other tools as well. So to get at what you were just describing, we can do a level of traffic stress analysis for the different bike networks that would be represented here and be able to say, well, the Memorial Parkway is currently a level of stress 4, which would mean that it is very difficult for people riding. It's not a facility that is safe or comfortable for people of all ages and abilities. Let's say we put in a protected bike lane, then it suddenly is going to get a lot better. It's probably going to move to a level of stress 2 or even a level of stress 1, which becomes a facility that the data shows is one that is going to increase the number of people biking. So those are the kinds of analyses that we need to do to supplement the model, especially when we're talking about a multimodal investment scenario.
Okay, thanks.
So that's a perfect example.
A good explanation too.
Thanks. So just a couple of quick maps that will show you in terms of model outputs. So what you're seeing here on the screen, we've got on the left the 2018 existing network. And so we showed this just because this is the existing conditions as of 2018, the transportation networks that exist. And what you're seeing in red are some of the heavier volume corridors and more congested corridors, really from a vehicular standpoint again. The 2050 base network that we're showing here is looking at the business as usual growth, so just our baseline growth. It takes the 2018 network and adds some of what we are calling the base projects. So North Reserve and Scott Street, it builds out Mullen. There are a handful of other of the committed projects that we've included in the scenarios that get included here. So we just wanted to be able to illustrate, with taking no action at all in terms of the transportation scenarios we talked about today, you start to notice that, the network, just because of the growth of the region, does go from having a lot of green to a lot more red on some of the key corridors. And so that's illustrating more travel demands and more vehicles, more people on these roadways.
Jennifer, that's with our existing land uses.
Correct. Yep. This uses the business as usual growth. You're right on that. So this alarmingly colored chart, don't worry, you don't have to interpret this whole thing, but we wanted to show you just some of what we're starting to see as we look at initial model results. We have not yet modeled the regional equity scenario. Dave's working on that, right? David Gray from the MPO is working on that right now. Not you, Commissioner, you're off the hook for that piece. And so we've colored here, we've got a scale that ranges from kind of a maroon or reddish color into a darker green color. And what we're showing is these first two columns are that base network. So this is our 2050 network. And then we're looking at the two different land use approaches, or the two different growth approaches, business as usual, and then strategic growth. So this column, this business as usual column, matches what we just looked at on the last map. You can use that for point of comparison. So when we show something in red versus something in green, we're saying that it's headed in a direction that is not the ideal direction in terms of what the region would like to see. So for example, when we look at vehicle miles traveled and look at business as usual in 2050, vehicle miles traveled goes up pretty significantly, in part because of the growth. But then what you can see, even just looking at the base network, so not looking at our scenario, our transportation scenarios at all, if we stick with the 2050 base network, but use a strategic growth approach, VMT, vehicle miles traveled, does not increase as much as it does in business as usual. So you start to see some of the potential benefits, if you're trying to reduce vehicle miles traveled, of a strategic growth approach. And then you can compare the new connections and the enhanced connections scenarios back to the base. So if we look at new connections, business as usual, the business as usual with those new connections investments does a little bit better than not making those investments. But if we go with strategic growth, it does even more in terms of reducing vehicle miles traveled. So that's just an example of how we start to look at the outputs we're seeing. We've included in this table vehicle hours of delay, and then also we look at daily person trips by different modes. And so that starts to get us to our mode share. So what we want to be seeing is more and more of the yellow and green colors in terms of walking, biking, and transit trips increasing, again, in line with the region's ambitious goals for mode share. So again, these are early results. We'll be working through those much more, but wanted to also give you a quick example of one of the non-model analyses that we're doing to get at some of the questions you were asking. So this particular analysis looks at accessibility of the networks. And this is a walkshed analysis. And so we're looking at, in these analyses, the number of jobs that a person could walk to or reach in a wheelchair using the different networks within 15 minutes on these maps. And then we'll look at 30 minutes in a second. So this looks ahead to 2050 and the jobs that we envision. These maps are using the business as usual growth so that we can really illustrate the difference in the transportation networks. And so what you see here is this lighter color, the lighter blue color, is with our base network. So if we didn't make any of the investments we've been talking about today and just went with our base network in 2050, those are the jobs that you could reach. And then when you add in the new connection scenario, you get a couple of additional pockets of this darker blue. So building the new connections would give you access to just a few more jobs within a 15-minute walk. You can compare that to the enhanced connections scenario. The lighter blue, the base, is the same on this map, but you see a lot more dark blue. So suddenly you have walking access to a lot more jobs by building the enhanced connections network. So that's a 15-minute walkshed. And then if we expand it to 30 minutes, you can see how much of the region is covered. Yeah, Dave, sorry.
Jennifer, could you go back to that
of course
previous slide, and maybe it's similar on the next one too, and not to pick on Josh's neighborhood too much here, but I'm just curious what the job cluster is and target range out there that's been identified as being more walkable.
I think it's the world headquarters of Clark Fork Organics Farm, the tower.
That's what I was wondering.
I think
how are the jobs identified? I guess maybe that's the question.
Because I had the same question, Dave, about the rattlesnake.
Yeah, good point there. Yeah,
on up
the
there?
peas garden. It looks like it's expanding, perhaps.
Yep.
Yeah, Aaron, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, and maybe there's some explanation of like what if the colors are households that are, or the total number of jobs in those areas. But some of those places like the Target Range Orchard Homes, if you think about that out there, you have community hospital, you have Fort Missoula Regional Park, you have the school, Big Sky School, and then whatever future employment grow. I mean, again, this is 2050, so it's not necessarily just what's there today. It's what could be there in 30 years from now. And so thinking about that change, that some of that is projected in that land use sort of growth scenarios.
Yeah, I guess that's more so the question is what are the colors predicated on in terms of is it related to the land use designations or zoning that would allow for certain types of commercial enterprises, or just what's going into the calculation here?
Yeah, oh, go ahead, Aaron, sorry.
No, we have a whole memo related to how the employment is forecast to 2050. It's one of the trickier parts of the model, just because it is a little bit harder and our zoning is a little less specific. And the model sort of breaks down 6 general classes of employment types in order to get some refinement of how many trips are they attracting or generating. And so there's sort of a whole process of how those jobs get placed and forecast into 2050. But essentially it's keeping ratios, sort of like jobs to household ratios, the same in 2050 as 2018. I feel like I'm really oversimplifying this, but just to give a sense of how we do that forecast. And then those employment numbers are allocated, or jobs are allocated based on the underlying land use and zoning, so that we're not putting a job in a residentially zoned block, for instance. So there's a little bit of, modeling of the underlying land use that's tough for employment more so than households, I think.
Thanks. I admittedly did not read the memo clearly.
I don't know if we've shared that. It gets pretty.
That was kind of dense. It's all right. Thanks.
Right, so that's 15 minutes. And then if we look at 30 minutes, within a 30-minute walk using these same networks, you can see again, just in the base without making investments, you obviously are going to cover more of the region in terms of what you can access, but you start to see areas with the new connections investment, the darker color, where you're getting access to even more jobs. And then again, with enhanced connections, you see more darker areas. So an expanded number of jobs that you can reach within that 30-minute walk. And then these numbers are rough. They are not final. We're still working through the details, but I thought there were a couple of interesting takeaways here. And this is, again, looking at 2050 jobs, but we wanted to compare the differences between the business as usual and strategic growth. And as Aaron mentioned, when we think about concentrating households in a few of those larger areas, the more strategic and focused growth, we assume that the jobs follow because of the way that the model works. But what's interesting is that if you move from business as usual to strategic growth, the number of jobs that you have accessible within a 15-minute walk, just looking at the base without making any transportation investments, jumps up to, it's a 60% increase. So that's obviously pretty substantial. And then when you're comparing the enhanced connections, that network, to the new connections and the base, you get many, many more jobs that are in walking distance within a 15 to 30-minute walk in either the business as usual or the strategic growth scenario. And we saw that reflected in the maps, but just also kind of helpful to look at some actual numbers and see what the difference looks like. So again, these are rough. I don't want to get anybody too attached to them, but the quick takeaway is that when we think about 2050 and the enhanced connections scenario, it does seem to be providing more access to jobs within a 15 to 30-minute walk than the new connections or the base scenario. So we'll be doing this analysis for biking, for transit access, and for driving access as well. And then we'll build it out for the regional equity scenario. So that's just an example of the kind of analyses that we'll do to be able to answer some of the questions and come back to you all with more information that is helpful for making a decision about the scenario to move forward. So just to wrap us up for today, Aaron mentioned that we're getting ready for a big round of engagement this fall. And as you know from what we've just walked through, like, this is meaty stuff. it can be a lot for people to try and absorb. And so we're going to be focused over the next few weeks, not only on completing the analysis, but in creating some materials that help to educate folks about what we're seeing, and then really provide a handful of options for people to weigh in on. What is jumping out to them in terms of the scenarios? What questions do they have? What's resonating and what's not? And then we're going to use a variety of digital, printed, Dropbox and poster approaches, as well as neighborhood-focused meetings, which may very well be virtual, will probably be virtual, but to connect with folks more directly and really provide some opportunities for input. So that is what comes next. Any other questions?
Thanks for all your work, Jennifer. This is good stuff. Questions, comments from the yeah, Peter.
I guess I don't know quite what role I should take here, which hat to wear. You know, planning board is a combination city and county. But what I'm concerned about is that if you ask, if we're looking at walking paths in the city and availability of work and transportation in that way, we're talking about city with expanding in different areas, you know, Target Range, Rattlesnake, Mullen Road, maybe even Grant Creek. But if we look at it from the county's point of view, we're not addressing Lolo, Frenchtown, East Missoula. And so if I'm looking at this from the county's point of view, I'm not interested in how easy it is to walk to work, because none of the people who are coming from the outside in are walking. And I don't know how to add that in or subtract it from the considerations that we need to provide.
Peter, I don't know that there's a clear answer to that, as much as to say what you are teeing up is really important, and part of the reason that we want to use a whole host of different tools to get at the benefits of the scenarios. If we said, you know, the number of jobs that you can walk to is the only thing that matters, that would be both foolish and also not representative of the region. And so if we're doing that same analysis, looking at driving, looking at transit, looking at biking as just one component of accessibility, I think that starts to give us a better picture of what access and connectivity across the region will look like. So it's a good reminder as we move into the rest of this analysis to ensure that we are using approaches that really reflect the different conditions of the region and the connections that people need to make.
Yeah, and
Peter, just to throw an idea into the mix here for planning board is, and I've long thought that there's maybe unrealized potential in the planning board in terms of providing some advice, consultation, additional thought on some of these broader issues. And I think you hit on one in that to the extent that we are planning in a way outside of the city of Missoula and in outlying communities such as Frenchtown, Lolo, Shealy, to make those communities walkable, to make them places of employment such that people can live their lives in a meaningful and vibrant way in these communities and not necessarily have to commute into Missoula, then certainly that has a huge impact on transportation infrastructure that's necessary to get folks not only into our community, but moving around our community. So all of that to say, at a more higher level strategic level, I think there's an opportunity for planning board to schedule time to have some suggestion or discussion outside of the sorts of projects that come your way for review.
Yeah.
yeah,
Thanks, Dave. I think I think that's a great idea.
yeah. Oh, sorry, Peter. Keep going.
I was just going to say, from the commissioner side, I would love to see the planning board take on a more expansive role. Be excited to hear what those folks had to say, given that there's a great body of expertise there. And I don't feel like we fully make use of them.
Well, thank you for saying that. And I think this should lead to further discussions because our time is pretty much taken up by what we're asked to act on and not the bigger issues that we see.
There are only a couple instances in the last handful of years that I can remember the planning board. It's such a tiresome phrase, but being proactive, that's really not the role as we've written it. But I think in this sort of thing, it would be wonderful for them to play a bit of that role.
Yeah,
Aaron?
I was just going to add that there's, well, one that I sort of tentatively on the schedule for planning board sometime during our next sort of public outreach push. And I think that's a good place to have some of these conversations and to think through, you know, the MPO can only plan within the MPO's area. We can't really tell Sealy Lake dictate what investments are happening there. And, but what we can do is talk about things like how accessible Missoula is for those multiple modes will support other transportation options for people outside. So if, you know, a good example is like commuter bus system. Once you get into Missoula, you still need to get where you need to go fairly easily and accessibly in order for that to work. And so the same might be true. We've talked about that with passenger rail, that, you know, to sort of support passenger rail, having all of these other modes in the city are helpful to support that big regional, because someone coming here from Seattle, they get off at the train station, then they can access all of Missoula's transportation options, not have to get a car, not drive, etc. And I think the same is true for people coming into the Missoula from outside the community, that if you can either drive in, park, do all of your trips without having to drive more, that's a benefit to the region and to that individual. But also for those sort of regional transportation options, whatever they might be in the future. So there's a relationship there that I think we should try to communicate and talk through and think about how we're investing in ways that will support those other kinds of improvements.
And not that I would ever want to dissuade folks from coming to Missoula, but to the extent that we create communities where folks can live and work and have good solid infrastructure in, that may eliminate some need for folks to have to commute as much as they currently do.
Aaron, so this is tangential, but as we were talking about it, I was wondering how you looked at equity issues on not just within the city, but within Missoula County as you were trying to assess that greater equity model.
Part of that, and Jennifer, jump in if you may have more familiarity with that, but just part of it is thinking about some of that regional equity investment. So are we providing good connections to places like East Missoula so that it's easy to get from there into other services, or even just, you know, the safety along East Missoula's Main Street corridor. And, you know, it's one of the reasons we're doing that corridor planning study too, to try to address some of those more regional equity issues.
I mean, sorry to jump in, but, you know, when the median house price in Missoula I saw in Zillow is $370,000, you know, creating equity, you know, places that people can live within Missoula, even East Missoula, may be difficult at the lower income levels. And I guess the question is, how do we address that relative to, you know, investing in infrastructure that then connects better to Clinton or Lolo or somewhere else where housing may be less expensive?
Yeah, part of what we tried to get at, Don, with some of the criteria around equity was to get at the affordability piece of it. And so, yes, looking at senior and affordable housing, but we do hope to explore a joint housing and transportation cost index to help assess the value of the scenarios and what they might do in terms of affordability. So I don't know that that directly addresses the challenges with affordability in the city, but hopefully building out those pieces in terms of affordable and senior housing, access to job services and schools, and looking at some of the census data as a baseline for where populations are living, not just in the city, but the county and region as a whole can be a piece of knitting that together.
You all, I gotta jump to get to the next one, but thank you all for a great discussion and great presentation. Super interesting. Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Josh.
I have a quick question about sorry, the public participation. You had a list and I can't remember if I saw councils or working with the neighborhood office and perhaps, for the county, you don't have neighborhood councils, but you have
Community councils.
community councils. So reaching out to them so that they can at least participate, provide some feedback, I think would be great.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, particularly those that brush up against the planning area, such as East Missoula, Lolo, West Valley out in Frenchtown.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Aaron, did you have something you wanted to say?
No,
or-
only that we're,
okay.
we're thinking about it. It's on our plan.
Okay.
Trying to create opportunities, whether it's like weekly drop-in sessions where people can come and just talk about the plan, or trying to get out to as many of those meetings as possible, knowing that it might be tough to go to all 22 city neighborhood council meetings plus all, I can't remember how many community councils, but there's a handful. So that would be a lot of individual meetings, but if we can sort of group them by region and create those opportunities, that is definitely part of our goal.
What we
I
could
think
do,
a lot of
Bill,
them, sorry.
go ahead, Mirta.
I was going to say that I think a lot of them have or put newsletters out to a lot of people. And so maybe you don't have to attend, but you can at least provide information where they can find more information.
And Aaron, what we've been doing in the world of COVID-19 on the county side is having monthly all community council meetings with the Board of County Commissioners, such that they will still have their own meetings perhaps, but we have a forum on a monthly basis where they all come together. So that would be an easier opportunity to get the word out. And I can't help but asking, Bob, does the fact that you're sitting in the middle of a roadway align with Vision Zero for MDT?
Yeah, it's kind of humorous, isn't it? That I feel like I need to have a hard hat and a vest on.
Bob, did you have something you wanted to say? And I know Don had his hand up earlier too.
No, I'm just saying goodbye, everybody. I got to get into my next meeting, so I got to run, but thanks for the great discussion and the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Don, were you wanting to get a word in or no?
I'm good, thanks.
Okay, anyone else? We are running out of time and losing folks by attrition here. Well, thanks so much, Jennifer. Super presentation, good information. I look forward to seeing how the public engagement process goes from here on out.
Great. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. We have no old business today. The one thing I just mentioned, and don't have many people left here, but we had a great passenger rail summit last month. We had nearly 500 folks register for this thing across the nation, thanks to Mountain Line and the MPO for helping co-sponsor the event. So a lot of interest out there. So thanks everyone who was able to participate. And there's a recording of that event on our website, which is montanapassengerrailsummit.org if you're interested. Any other announcements, Aaron, staff?
I was going to mention that applied and we were selected to participate in the Smart Growth America Champions Institute. And so I'm hoping that we can learn a lot of really cool strategies for making some projects happen that can address some of the non-motorized and active transportation goals that we have. So I will keep you posted.
Yeah, congratulations, Mirta. That's fantastic.
And then what I wanted to just put out there that we do have our East Missoula Highway 200 corridor study. We have a public meeting on Thursday. So just a couple of nights away at 7 p.m. We have a virtual link where you can register if you go to the website, but we're going to present the preferred alternative for that project that came out of all of the public input and comments and feedback that we received over the summer on the various design alternatives. So that's an exciting sort of getting close to the close to the end on that project, or starting to see it sort of come together. So if anyone's interested, 7 p.m. on Thursday, you can go to the MPO website to find that registration link, or reach out to me or John or anyone else on the MPO team. We can get you set up.
Aaron,
Thanks,
I had a question. We have a planning board meeting tonight, and I wanted to present sort of a summary of our discussions. But I was thinking, are you and Jennifer going to present to the planning board sometime later in the year? I could just say stay tuned.
Yep. Yeah, I think once we're in that public, so sometime late November, early December is, I think, tentatively what's looking good on the planning board calendar. So
thanks, guys. Sorry for that.
No, that's good. Thanks, Peter. Debbie, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think that that Peter and Don summarized well some of the conversations we had on our offline preview, and I just really support projects that can lead to attainable housing that can support workforce development and interior growth and everything that we're trying to do in the strategic model versus the business as usual.
Great.
That's it.
Okay, we've managed to use up all of our time once again. So thanks for the great conversation, everyone. And unless there's anything else, we'll be adjourned.
Thanks.
Have a good day.